Russian President Vladimir Putin has sought to project authority in an address to the nation following the weekend's armed rebellion by Wagner mercenaries. He said the rebellion threatened Russia's very existence and promised to punish those behind it. He didn't mention Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the mercenary group, by name. In his own statement, Prigozhin denied the revolt had been aimed at overthrowing elected authorities. Nevertheless, the incident has left the Kremlin battling to regain control of the narrative.
After a weekend of mayhem and revolt, Operation Save Face has kicked in at the Kremlin. It started with this video, released on Russian state TV, with Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu front and centre. Seen apparently visiting the front line in Ukraine, it's his first public appearance since the Wagner revolt, and a clear signal that he's still in charge. And then came a call for unity from Russia's Prime Minister, who praised President Putin's leadership during a glum-faced cabinet meeting in Moscow.
Under these circumstances, it's important to ensure the sovereignty and independence of our country, the safety and well-being of our citizens. We need to act together as one team, maintain the unity of all forces by lining up behind the president and take calculated joint decisions to implement tasks given by the head of state.
The US and others have described Saturday's revolt as a direct challenge to the Russian president's leadership, but the Wagner leader and his forces have so far faced no punishment, despite Putin's clear anger. And as for Yevgeny Prigozhin himself, he's supposed to be in Belarus after pulling out with his troops on Saturday night. Whether he's arrived there yet is still unknown, but he has released an 11-minute audio message in which he explains his reasons for taking action.
There were two important factors for our decision to turn around. The first is that we did not want to spill Russian blood. The second is that we were marching to show our protest, but not to overthrow the government of the country.
That was followed a few hours later by a promise from President Putin to Wagner fighters in a late-night address.
Today you have the opportunity to continue your service for Russia by signing a contract with the Defence Ministry or other military and law enforcement structures, or to go back to your family and loved ones. Those who want can leave for Belarus. The promise I gave will be fulfilled.
But there was no mention of the instigator-in-chief and Wagner leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose life and future may still be on the line.
Well, for more, let's bring in DW Russia analyst Nadine Eggert in the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. Konstantin, there's a lot to unpack. Let's start with Putin, though. What's your key takeaway from Vladimir Putin's address?
Well, the key takeaway is that Putin was actually expected to say something historic. That is what his press secretary told in different sort of Telegram channel messages and speaking to the agencies. But nothing really historic happened. So my key takeaway is that everyone in the Kremlin is in panic and doesn't know what to do. So instead of that, Putin said, well, we kind of softly disband the Wagner Group. If you want, you can go home. If you don't want, you can go to Belarus. Why should you go to Belarus? That means that you cannot go to Russia. You're not welcome to Russia anymore. But definitely it's clear. Putin is panicked, and you've seen these faces of the Russian cabinet in the report. They don't look very sort of bright and cheery. I suppose there is a lot of chaos now in Moscow, and I think the main chaos, or the reason for the chaos, is that Putin did not expect people in Rostov and Voronezh to receive the Wagner Group as heroes, as liberators, as an alternative authority. And I think this is the main question now in Russian politics today. Putin has been seen as very weak, and He's now trying to shore up his authority. Whether he'll succeed, frankly speaking, I'm not certain.
So knowing that, Konstantin, and now knowing the deal that Prigozhin agreed to, is it fair to say the Wagner boss blinked?
Yes, he did. And his explanations that were also in the report are definitely lies. Putin's Russia is an empire of lies, but this is an absolutely exceptional thing when absolutely everyone lies and everyone knows it. Definitely something went wrong for Prigozhin. My suspicion, that's only a suspicion, don't want to conspiracy theorize here, that he expected some help from within the regime, and this help didn't come for some reason. And because of that, he had to turn back and pretend that everything is going all right, and he's just such a generous person who doesn't want to spill Russian blood, although he was prepared to do it. So I suppose that this is not the end of the story, and frankly speaking, I do not believe he will stay for long in Belarus if he ever even went there, because it will not be safe for him there. Russian security services operate in Belarus as they wish. This is a de facto semi-colony of Russia. So for Prigozhin to stay there will be very, very weird. He'll either have to go to Africa, where he was, conducting his mercenary operations, or find another refuge.
Yeah, what about the Wagner fighters then? Are some of the most revered and feared fighters in Russia. By contrast, Russian soldiers are known to be ill-treated, undertrained, some would say, and underpaid. What would motivate the Wagner fighters then to join the Russian army now?
Not much, but at the same time, I would say that their military prowess is a bit exaggerated. They're good at the so-called hybrid war, where you have to lie and kind of insinuate yourself into vanquishing your enemy. But look, the Wagnerites were not very useful when they were fighting near Bakhmut, trying to storm a small town, even by Ukrainian standards, not even Russian ones, for 10 months. So I think their military prowess is exaggerated. I think some will join the army. Some will be disillusioned and will go home, and some will try to find new employment. Because I do think that although Putin is scared of Prigozhin and his troops, but using the so-called private military companies, using mercenaries, is not at all excluded for the Russian regime. I think that's their lifeline still if they want to continue fighting in Ukraine. Russian army turned out to be not as good, but probably not as bad as many people expected. So I do think they will not be able to do away with the mercenary armies at all.
DW's Nadine Eggert, thank you so much.
For some analysis, we're joined now by Doug Clane, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, where he focuses on Russia's war in Ukraine, authoritarianism in Russia, and Ukraine's democracy-building process. He's joining us from Fairfax, Virginia in the U.S. Thank you for joining us. Putin has given Wagner fighters a choice now between joining the Russian army or relocating to Belarus. What's behind this strategy?
Thanks for having me. So Putin has had to walk a tightrope throughout this situation. There are few figures in Russia who could do what Prigozhin has done so far and still be alive today. If Putin were to immediately kill Prigozhin, or have him jailed, he risks turning Prigozhin into a martyr. And Prigozhin, remember, has tens of thousands of fighters loyal to him, not directly to the Russian government. That's what's behind Russia's effort to try to get these Wagner fighters to sign on officially with the army, to try to get them to be directly loyal to the Russian military and government and not personally to Prigozhin. There's still a lot, obviously, that we don't know. But in trying to send Prigozhin to Belarus, that may be something of a compromise for Putin's government, trying to sideline Prigozhin without martyring him.
Putin hasn't made any further mention of Prigozhin, despite this announcement that there's a deal that he could go to Belarus. But what do you think will happen to Prigozhin in the future now?
Well, Putin not mentioning Prigozhin by name is a tactic that he's actually used before, most famously with Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, never mentioning the name of this other figure who could perhaps present an alternative to Putin himself. Now he's using that tactic with Prigozhin. I think that the Kremlin watched the images that emerged from Rostov-on-Don when Wagner and Prigozhin were there, where Russians poured out into the streets and treated Prigozhin and his forces like returning heroes. That is something that I think frightened and shocked the Kremlin quite a bit. The fact that there's this other figure who is able to garner support within Russia and present something of an alternative to Putin.
And does this mean the end of the Wagner mercenary group?
I don't think so. Wagner is, it's some of the best fighters that Russia has. And at the end of the day, this whole rebellion and struggle has been purportedly over a disagreement over how best to prosecute the war to annihilate Ukraine. Wagner's some of the best fighters that Russia has, and Russia's not doing so well. They need these tens of thousands of guys to go back to Ukraine and keep fighting to try to save this war effort. At the same time, they want to make sure that they don't keep roving around within Russia, willy-nilly, doing what they've been doing for the last week. They need to get these guys under control and back on message.
But I'm not clear on that point. If they're banished to Belarus or join the military, that would mean that the organization, Wagner, would no longer be in charge of these men, right?
Right. So they are trying to co-opt Wagner's fighters formally into the Russian military. I think that's the best scenario in the eyes of the Russian government, to keep these relatively skilled fighters and have them formally under their control. But if that's not possible, then at least try to get them out of the way. Send them to Belarus, where they can't present as direct of a threat to the Russian government as they have in the past week. Remember, they were only a couple hundred miles away from rolling into Moscow. I think they want to get these guys as far away as possible.
I think this came as a surprise to a lot of people watching the events unfold, but Putin praised Russia's unity on Monday. What do you make of that? Is Russia a united country right now?
I think that's a very open question. Again, I'll point back to these videos that emerged of how Russians were treating Wagner. This rebellion was stifled pretty quickly. And again, we don't know the details of this deal and what happened behind the scenes, but if things had progressed further, I think that everybody in the Kremlin is wondering how many people across Russia would have treated Wagner the same way that the people in Rostov-on-Don treated them. Putin, of course, now has to paint a picture of unity, has to reassert control, and try to firm up the myth that his authoritarian regime is invulnerable and inevitable. He's trying to do damage control now.
Doug Clane, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.